Julia's heart raced as she stared down at the contract, the ink still fresh on the paper. The air felt thick, the dim office lights flickering overhead, casting long shadows across the desk. Sarah's eyes were cold and unblinking, watching her like a hawk. "You're sure this is what you want?" Sarah's voice was smooth, calculated, her words ringing like a bell in Julia's ears. Julia's hands trembled as she held the pen, her mind swirling with doubt. Was this really the only choice? She had always been told that in this industry you had to make sacrifices, but this felt different. The weight of the paper in front of her seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The pressure from Sarah's unwavering gaze was suffocating. "You won't regret it," Sarah added, her voice low and persuasive. Julia's gaze flicked back to the document, then up to Sarah. The words on the page blurred in her vision, and the room seemed to close in. With a deep breath, she signed. As soon as the pen left the paper, she knew her life had just changed forever. Julia sat alone in her apartment that night, her mind racing. The contract she had signed weighed heavily on her, the memory of the moment still vivid. She tried to push the thought away, but it wouldn't leave her. She could feel it in her bones. Something was off. This wasn't what she had envisioned when she dreamt of success. She had always been the kind of person to make decisions on her own, to take control of her destiny. But this was different. Sarah had manipulated her, using every trick in the book to get what she wanted. Julia hadn't signed for this kind of control. She had wanted a partnership, a relationship that felt like a shared goal. Instead, she had signed away more than her freedom. It felt like her very soul. With each passing hour, she regretted it more. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Sarah. "You're going to thank me later," the message read. Julia stared at it, a bitter taste rising in her mouth. She had no idea what Sarah meant by that, but for the first time, she felt like she had lost control. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself, clenching her fists. Days went by in a blur. Julia's phone kept buzzing with messages and calls. Invitations for podcasts, social media posts, interviews. They all came with strings attached. As soon as she would agree to one, the media started twisting her words, misrepresenting her thoughts. They were editing the interviews, leaving her with a version of herself she didn't recognize. It was happening faster than she could keep up. It felt like she was sinking deeper with every appearance. The more she tried to clarify, the worse it got. The contract she signed was suffocating her. She couldn't fight back. The clause about non-disparagement was like a chain around her neck. She couldn't say anything bad about Sarah, not even about the way things were being manipulated. And it wasn't just the media. She could feel Sarah's control tightening every day from afar. It was as if Sarah's hand was always on her shoulder, guiding her, pulling her in directions she didn't want to go. Julia thought about quitting, about running away from it all. But the fear of what would happen next if she did, if she exposed everything, kept her frozen in place. No one would believe her. No one would care. Julia's breaking point came during a live podcast interview. The host, with a devilish grin, asked, "Is Sarah really the mentor you claim she is?" The question was simple, yet it felt like a trap. Julia could feel her heart pounding, her breath catching in her throat. She had been rehearsing her responses, careful not to say anything that could jeopardize her career or break the terms of the contract. But in that moment, something snapped. "No," Julia blurted out, her voice shaking. "She's not. She's been controlling everything from the start. I never wanted to sign that contract." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Silence filled the room, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world had paused. She could see the shock on the host's face, but it was nothing compared to the surge of panic that flooded her chest. The second she spoke those words, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. The damage was done. There was no taking it back. The aftermath was immediate. Social media exploded, and the media spun the story into a frenzy. Julia's phone rang off the hook, messages flooding in from all sides, some supportive, but most were condemning her. She had become a target. She was on the defensive, trying to explain herself, but every attempt to clarify only made things worse. Then, in the midst of the chaos, Sarah finally called. "What did you think would happen?" she said, her voice cold, devoid of emotion. "This is just the beginning, Julia. You can't take it back." Julia's chest tightened as she listened. She had made her choice, but now she had to face the consequences. There was no going back now. Her world had shifted in ways she couldn't have imagined. As the media storm raged around her, she found herself standing at the edge of something she wasn't sure she was ready for. But there was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur. Julia tried to escape the constant barrage of media, but it was impossible. Everywhere she went, the whispers followed. The internet had exploded, her name trending with headlines she didn't recognize. Exposed, betrayal, backlash, they were all the same. Her once private world was now a public spectacle, and there was no retreat. Sarah's silence was the loudest of all. She hadn't called, hadn't texted. It felt like a betrayal within a betrayal. Julia's phone became her worst enemy, the screen constantly lighting up with messages and notifications. Most were insults, some sympathetic, but none of them helped her. She tried to return to her routine, but it was like walking through a fog. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. She hadn't anticipated this kind of fallout. She didn't realize that speaking her truth would cost her so much. Her only comfort was the thought that maybe, just maybe, she could undo the damage if she apologized. But deep down she knew it would never be enough. Julia's patience was wearing thin. Days passed with no word from Sarah, and every time her phone buzzed, Julia's heart skipped a beat. She kept hoping irrationally that Sarah would reach out, that there would be some explanation, some comfort. But nothing came. Julia had spent years trying to impress Sarah, to prove herself worthy of the mentorship she had been offered. Yet now, it felt like Sarah had abandoned her, left her out to dry. It was cruel, yet oddly predictable. Sarah was the kind of person who played games with people's lives, and Julia had been no different. She could hear Sarah's voice in her head, "You'll thank me later." The words echoed, but now they sounded hollow. The worst part was Julia knew that even if Sarah did reach out, it would be for her own benefit, not Julia's. Sarah didn't care about her well-being. She cared about control. Julia had been a pawn, and now she was alone. The weight of the truth was unbearable. It felt like she had been in the dark for so long, and now the light had come on, only to reveal the mess she had made. Julia couldn't wait any longer. She had to take control. Sitting at her desk, her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she composed her first public response. It wasn't going to be a simple apology. No, this needed to be more than that. She had been painted as the villain, and if she didn't act soon, the story would be written for her. The media had already skewed the narrative, so she needed to clarify things, to explain her side in a way that felt real. Julia knew it wouldn't fix everything. In fact, she knew there would be even more backlash. But at least she could go down fighting. She began typing, her fingers flying over the keys. It wasn't easy. Every sentence felt like she was ripping open a wound, exposing herself in a way that she had never done before. Her vulnerabilities, her doubts, all laid bare. But this was the only way to regain control, to make people see her as human again. "I made a mistake," she typed, the words both painful and liberating. "But this is who I am. Take it or leave it." As soon as she hit send, her stomach dropped. There was no turning back now. The response was swift and merciless. Julia's statement was all over the internet within minutes. But it wasn't the redemption she had hoped for. Instead, her words were twisted, taken out of context. Headlines like "Julia cries for sympathy" and "Is she just playing the victim?" flooded every news outlet. The media spun her attempt at honesty into yet another reason to tear her down. Julia's phone exploded with notifications, but none of them were the support she had hoped for. Comments ranged from outright hatred to condescending pity. People had already made up their minds, and no amount of explanation could change that. She had been naive to think her words would change anything. The more she tried to defend herself, the deeper the hole she dug. It felt like she was suffocating in the pressure of it all. Sarah hadn't called. Julia's instincts told her Sarah was watching, letting her sink, waiting for the right moment to swoop in and claim victory. Julia closed her eyes, breathing deeply, trying to keep it together. But it was becoming too much. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could handle. Julia stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of resolve. The media storm was unrelenting, but she couldn't hide anymore. She was tired of running from her truth. Her fingers shook as she typed another message to her team, asking for a press conference. She was done with silence, done with waiting for someone else to control her narrative. It was time to face the public, to take accountability, and to stand up for herself. She couldn't be the victim anymore. She needed to be the one to tell her story, the way she wanted it told. "This is my life," she whispered to her reflection, "and I'm not afraid of it anymore." There was no more pretending. Julia was ready to step back into the spotlight, not as a puppet but as someone who would fight for her future. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be pretty. But it would be real. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. The day of the press conference arrived, and Julia felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The media circus had been relentless, and now, standing in front of the cameras, she had a choice: shrink or rise. She knew that this was her moment to take back control, to present herself not as the villain the media had painted her to be, but as a person who made a mistake and was willing to face the consequences. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone in front of her, but she steadied herself. Her heart raced, but her resolve grew stronger with each beat. The room was filled with flashing cameras, reporters whispering, but Julia focused on her breath. She had rehearsed this speech for days, but now, in front of this audience, it all felt more real than ever. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the storm swirling inside her. "But this is my truth. I won't run from it anymore." She paused, allowing her words to settle. The truth was out, now. She couldn't take it back, but she was no longer afraid of what came next. As soon as the press conference ended, the floodgates opened. Social media erupted once again. The headlines immediately began to twist her words. "Julia admits to lying and is she playing the victim?" The backlash was swift and unrelenting. No matter how much she tried to explain, her words were being drowned out by the noise of the media machine. Julia sat in her dressing room, the door closed, staring at her phone in disbelief. She had hoped that this would be the turning point, the moment when she could set the record straight. Instead, it seemed like the world had already made its judgment. People weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in scandal, in drama. And Julia had become the latest victim of that hunger. She couldn't help but wonder if this was how Sarah had always felt, standing behind the scenes, pulling the strings, watching the chaos unfold. As Julia scrolled through the comments, she felt her resolve start to crack. She wanted to give up, to run away from it all, but deep down, she knew that wasn't an option. She had to keep fighting, no matter how exhausting it was. Julia had always been independent, thinking she could handle everything on her own. But now, more than ever, she realized how much she needed others. She reached out to her closest friends, hoping to find some solace in their words. It wasn't easy for her to ask for help, but she knew she couldn't continue this fight alone. "I don't know what to do," she confessed to Emily, her best friend. "It's like every step forward I'm pushed 2 steps back." Emily's voice on the other end of the line was comforting, steady. "You're not alone in this, Julia. We're with you. We always have been." The words were simple, but they filled a void Julia hadn't realized was there. She had been so focused on fixing things on her own that she had neglected the people who cared about her. For the first time in days, Julia felt a sense of peace. It wasn't going to be easy, but maybe with her friends by her side, she could weather this storm. Later that night, Julia's phone buzzed once again. This time, it was Sarah. The message was short but direct. "We need to talk." Julia's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, but she wasn't prepared for it. She called Sarah back, trying to steady her nerves. The conversation began civilly, but Julia could sense the same cold manipulation lurking beneath the surface. "You've made a mess of everything, Julia," Sarah said, her voice dripping with authority. "I told you this would happen. You should have trusted me." Julia bit her lip, fighting the urge to lash out. "You never told me it would be like this. You never said I would lose myself in the process." Sarah's tone softened, but the control was still there. "I'm the one who's been looking out for you, Julia. I'm the one who's always had your best interests at heart. You need me whether you like it or not." The words stung, and for a moment, Julia felt like she was falling back into the trap. She had been so sure of herself earlier, but now, doubt began to creep in. Was Sarah right? Did she need Sarah more than she thought? The days passed and Julia's frustration continued to build. Sarah's influence still loomed large over her, but Julia could no longer live like this. She could no longer be manipulated, controlled, or made to feel insignificant. She had made her decision. It was time to confront Sarah, to end this toxic relationship once and for all. Julia stood in front of the mirror, taking a deep breath as she steadied herself. She wasn't going to back down this time. With newfound strength, she picked up her phone and called Sarah, the weight of the conversation hanging over her. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. Sarah responded, but Julia didn't let her get a word in. "I'm done with this," Julia declared. "I'm not going to let you control me anymore. I don't need you to tell me what's best for me." There was silence on the other end, and for a brief moment, Julia felt a flicker of fear. But it quickly dissipated, replaced by the undeniable sense that she had made the right choice. The conversation wasn't easy, but as it ended, Julia knew that she had taken back her power. The days after her confrontation with Sarah felt like a strange stillness. Julia was no longer in the grip of manipulation, but the silence that followed was suffocating. She found herself questioning her next steps, unsure of what came next. There was a part of her that feared the unknown, the uncertainty of what her future might hold without Sarah in it. But there was also a strange sense of freedom. Julia had spent years catering to others' expectations, and for the first time, she felt like she was standing on her own. The world outside her apartment felt distant, like a storm on the horizon. She couldn't avoid it forever, though. She had made her choices, and now, she would face the consequences. The press, the critics, the media, it was all still there, waiting for her to fall. But Julia was done running. She stared out of her window, watching the city pulse below her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. There was no turning back. The storm was coming, and she was going to face it head on. The following week, Julia found herself back in front of the cameras, this time with a purpose. She had been invited to a live television interview, a chance to finally speak out without the distortion of tabloids and headlines. She stood backstage, nerves racing through her body. But this time, it was different. She wasn't scared of what the world thought of her. She had nothing left to lose. "Just speak from the heart," her PR team had said. But she knew it wasn't just about speaking. This was about reclaiming the narrative. As she walked out onto the stage, the bright studio lights bathed her in an unforgiving glow. But Julia felt steady. Her words would be her own this time. She wasn't going to apologize for being human, for making mistakes. She would show the world who she truly was, flaws and all. As the interviewer greeted her, Julia took a deep breath and smiled. It was time to face the storm and emerge stronger than before. The moment arrived faster than she expected. The interviewer, sensing the tension in the air, asked the question that would change everything. "Can you explain what really happened with Sarah?" Julia hesitated for just a moment before answering, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Sarah was never the mentor I thought she was," Julia began, her eyes locked on the camera, knowing millions were watching. "She controlled everything in my life, every decision I made, every step I took. She was there, pulling the strings. I thought I was in control, but I wasn't. She used me, and she used others too. I signed that contract not because I believed in it, but because I was made to believe it was the only way." The words felt freeing, yet they carried the weight of the years she had spent under Sarah's influence. Julia could feel the tension in the room shift as the audience processed what she was saying. There was no turning back now. The truth was out. The world would have to see her for who she truly was. The reaction to Julia's words was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted, but this time it wasn't filled with the usual insults. People were listening. Finally. Some were shocked by her revelation, others were sympathetic, and some were simply outraged at Sarah's manipulation. Julia's phone buzzed relentlessly with messages of support from unexpected places. But there were still the detractors, those who accused her of trying to shift blame or play the victim. Julia knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The media would turn on her again, and the critics would start to pick apart her every word. But in this moment, she felt a sense of relief she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in ages, Julia felt like she was in control. No longer the pawn, she was finally the one calling the shots. She had exposed the truth, and now, it was her turn to stand tall, regardless of the consequences. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Julia navigated the media frenzy, but now she did so on her own terms. She was no longer defined by the opinions of others. Slowly, she started to rebuild her career, this time on her own, without Sarah's influence hanging over her. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast. There were still moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she was making the right choices. But with every decision, she grew stronger, more confident. For the first time in her life, Julia felt like she was truly living for herself. She had reclaimed her story, her life, and the control she had lost so many years ago. The road ahead was uncertain, but Julia was ready to face whatever came next. As she stood in front of the mirror one last time, she smiled at her reflection. This was who she was meant to be. The storm had passed, and now, she was free. Julia's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The chaos of the media storm had settled, and now, she was beginning to rebuild. Not just her career, but herself. The past few months had been nothing short of a roller coaster. She had lost and gained so much, but what remained was the clarity that she was the one in control of her future. No longer a victim of circumstances, Julia had taken her power back. She had spent years living in the shadow of others, her mentor, her public persona, her fears. But now, as she sat at her desk, reviewing new project proposals, she felt a sense of excitement. For the first time in her life, she was making decisions for herself, without anyone else's influence. It wasn't perfect, and it would take time to regain what she had lost, but it felt like the beginning of something real. Julia smiled as she signed the first contract of her new journey. A project that represented her vision, her voice. The weight of the past was lifting, and ahead of her, there was only the future. The first project was a challenge, but Julia welcomed it. It was an opportunity to work with a brand she believed in, a cause she truly cared about. The team she had assembled was small but strong, people who shared her vision and passion. As she sat in the brainstorming session, she felt the familiar rush of excitement. The ideas flowed freely now with no fear of judgment, no one telling her what she could or couldn't do. Her voice was heard, her opinions respected. It was a far cry from the control Sarah had once had over her. The project was about authenticity, about telling a story that mattered, not for the sake of image or status, but because it was the right thing to do. Julia felt a sense of pride in this new direction, one that wasn't shaped by others, but by her own experiences and values. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. She just needed to be true to herself, and in that truth she was stronger than ever. Julia sat in the quiet of her apartment that evening, reflecting on how much had changed. It wasn't just her career that had transformed. It was her. The girl who had once feared confrontation, who had sought approval from everyone around her, was no longer there. That Julia had been shattered by the weight of other people's expectations, manipulated by the very people she trusted most. But the woman sitting in front of the window now was different. She had learned to embrace the hard truths, to confront her fears, and to stand tall in the face of adversity. Looking out over the city, she realized that the storm had passed. She wasn't perfect, and she wasn't without her flaws, but she had found a strength within herself she never knew existed. The woman in the reflection was someone she could be proud of. For the first time, Julia felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. There would still be challenges ahead, but she was ready for them. She had faced the storm, and now she was stronger for it. Just as Julia thought the worst was behind her, the challenges came rushing back. A former business associate from her past reached out, attempting to discredit her recent success. The offer was clear: bow down to their terms, or risk losing everything she had worked for. But Julia wasn't the same person anymore. The fear that once gripped her was gone, replaced by a steady resolve. She knew this was another test, another moment where she could either fall back into old patterns or stand firm. "I don't need your approval anymore," she replied, her voice calm but firm. The words were simple, but they held weight. The old Julia would have caved, would have tried to please, to appease. But not now. She had built something on her own terms, and no one could take that away from her. She had reclaimed her power, and it was hers to hold. With a final glance at the phone, Julia set it down. She wasn't going to let anyone dictate her future anymore. As Julia closed the door to her office for the day, she took a moment to pause. It had been a long and tumultuous journey, but she had come through it stronger than she ever imagined. The road ahead was still unknown, but it no longer filled her with fear. She had faced her darkest moments and emerged victorious. The weight of the past no longer held her down. She was free, truly free. The world had tried to define her, tried to break her, but she had found her own definition. Julia had learned that true strength wasn't in the battles she fought, but in the courage to stand up after each fall. She wasn't perfect, and she never would be, but she was enough. With a deep breath, she walked toward the door, ready for whatever came next. The future was hers to shape, and for the first time, she was ready to embrace it fully. The euphoria from reclaiming control over her career was beginning to fade, and with it came the inevitable doubt. Julia sat at her desk, staring at the new project in front of her. The papers were scattered, deadlines looming. She had come so far, but now, with success in her grasp, she felt an unfamiliar weight settle on her shoulders. Was she really ready for all this? The world had watched her rise from the ashes, but would they expect too much? The pressure to not just succeed, but to excel, was relentless. She wasn't used to leading a team, making decisions on her own. She had spent so many years listening to others, following their instructions, that the autonomy she once craved now felt like a burden. Julia stood up from her desk and walked to the window, gazing at the city below. The lights flickered as the night fell. It was beautiful, but it also seemed overwhelming. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that this was what she wanted. The uncertainty was part of the process, but the doubt still lingered. She wasn't sure if she had the answers, but she knew that she had to try. Feeling the weight of isolation pressing in, Julia picked up her phone and dialed Emily's number. Emily had been her rock throughout the ups and downs, always offering her support when she needed it most. As the phone rang, Julia wondered if it was time to be vulnerable, to admit that even though she had the success she had always dreamed of, she was still unsure of her place in it. "Hey, it's me," Julia said when Emily picked up. "I need to talk." The conversation started slowly, but soon Julia was pouring out everything: her fears, her doubts, her feelings of being out of her depth. Emily listened patiently, not interrupting, offering only the occasional word of encouragement. "You've already proven so much, Julia. You've come a long way and you're not alone in this," Emily said gently. "You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to keep moving forward." Julia smiled softly. Her heart lightened. The weight that had been pressing down on her seemed a little less heavy. Emily was right. Leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about having the courage to keep going, even when you didn't know what came next. The next day, Julia walked into the conference room with a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just another meeting. It was a turning point. She had prepared for this moment, and now, it was her time to lead. As her team sat around the table, Julia stood at the front, the whiteboard behind her filled with ideas. For the first time, she wasn't just an observer. She was the one guiding the conversation. "Here's what we're going to do," she began, her voice steady and clear. "We're going to focus on authenticity. This project isn't about selling a product. It's about telling a story that matters." She could feel the eyes of her team on her, waiting for direction. But instead of the usual nervousness, she felt a surge of confidence. The room was silent for a moment, then one of her colleagues spoke up. "I love this direction, Julia. It's fresh, it's bold." Julia smiled and nodded, feeling a sense of pride. She wasn't just making decisions, she was inspiring those around her. The meeting moved forward with energy and ideas flowing freely. By the end, Julia knew that she had taken the first step into her new role, and it felt right. As Julia's confidence grew, so did the realization that she needed to confront her past fully. Sarah had reached out once again, this time requesting a face-to-face meeting. Julia hesitated, but then knew that it was time. She couldn't move forward without putting the final pieces of the puzzle in place. When they met, it wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no grand confrontation. Instead, it was an honest conversation, one that Julia had never thought she would have. "I've made mistakes," Sarah admitted, her tone guarded. "But I'm still here, and I'm still offering you a way forward." Julia listened, but the words didn't sting the way they once would have. "I don't need your approval anymore," Julia replied calmly. "I've learned to stand on my own." The silence between them wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with understanding. Julia knew that she had finally let go of the past. She didn't need Sarah's permission to succeed anymore. She was already free. As the weeks passed, Julia's confidence grew. She had confronted the past, taken responsibility for her decisions, and now she was ready to fully step into her future. The journey had been hard, and the road ahead would be no different. But Julia no longer feared the unknown. She had found strength in vulnerability, courage in uncertainty. She wasn't the same woman who had signed that contract, nor was she the woman who had sought approval from others. She was something entirely new, someone who was unapologetically herself. As she walked into her office one morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows, she paused for a moment. She had come so far, but she knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was hers to shape, and she was ready to walk it, one step at a time. Julia stood backstage, her heart pounding as the lights from the stage flickered. "This is it," she whispered to herself, adjusting her outfit. "I've come this far, there's no going back." The stage manager called out, "You're on in 5, Julia." She took a deep breath. "Time to show the world who I am." The interviewer asked Julia, "What's the biggest lesson you've learned from everything you've been through?" Julia looked straight into the camera, her voice steady. "The biggest lesson I've learned is that I don't need anyone's approval to live my life. I've spent too many years hiding, trying to fit into others' expectations. But now I'm free to be myself, flaws and all." Julia scrolled through the messages on her phone, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you for showing me it's okay to be myself," one message read. Another said, "You can't please everyone, but you're doing great." Julia took a deep breath and set the phone down. "I'm enough, that's all that matters." As Julia looked out over the city from her apartment window, she whispered to herself, "I've come so far." The city lights below seemed to pulse with life, but Julia felt a quiet calm. "The storm's over, I'm not running anymore. I've finally found peace with who I am." Standing at the door of her apartment, Julia paused and smiled to herself. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "I'm not defined by my past anymore. I'm ready for whatever comes next." With a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped outside, ready to embrace the unknown.